So Eric, as a beginner, what are the best ways to gauge progress?
Yeah, I think for a beginner, you don't have to necessarily test quite as much either. A common thing in a program is you test your 1RMs, then you train it at a percentage of 1RM, or perhaps you might be gauging RPE, like how hard that felt, how close to failure were you. And there's issues with both of these. If you think about it in that example, which I think is a pretty reasonable one, if you can add 60 pounds to your squat going from 60 to 120, and I realize I said 10 pounds per week before over 12 weeks, which is bad math. It's 5 pounds per week. But let's say you can go from 60 to 120 pounds, pretty quickly. Do you really think your 1RM was accurate at the start when you can only squat 60 pounds? Probably not. One thing that has been observed in some research I've been a part of is that when you take someone who doesn't know how to execute a movement, if they're a novice with a squat, for example, their ability to actually execute a true 1RM is poor. So the way this has been validated, I did a cool study that was out of Dr. Mike Zerdos's lab in FAU, Florida Atlantic University. So we compared novice to highly experienced squatters, and we looked at their barbell velocity at 1RM. And there was like a zero point 0.1 meters per second difference in the two. So the novices, they recorded the 1RM at like 0.36, if I recall correctly. And I think the experience around 0.26 or 0.24. I don't have those numbers exactly right. But the point is that when you execute a 1RM and you're very proficient in a movement, the barbell should move very slow. And you grind, you grind, you grind. You might hit a sticking point you can't overcome. And then that's when you fail. But if you barely get it, that's a true 1RM. When a novice does this, they typically lose position, or just they simply don't know how to grind. And you typically see just kind of this abrupt stop. And the barbell was moving fast prior to it. So they don't have the neuromuscular capacity to grind. They don't have the ability to maintain the position. When you watch novices or even early stage intermediates go up and load, you see the technical aspect of the lift change as load goes up, while it is much more stable in advanced lifters. So what this means is that if you do a 1RM test, you're going to get some weird relationships. I've seen people I've worked with back in the day when I was a personal trainer work with, say, 50 pounds and be able to get 20 reps. And then they go up to 60 pounds and they can barely get one.
Mm.
So there's a certain, coordination and skill and load and also self-efficacy and belief that is a barrier to them actually expressing what they might be capable of if they build the skill of lifting more. So and also more importantly, a novice doesn't need to be lifting like 80% of their true 1RM to make strength gains. We actually have data showing just lifting more than you've been lifting is sufficient. So I think for a novice, you don't necessarily need to worry too much about getting a super accurate 1RM. You probably just need to make sure that what you're doing is, technically sound and no heavier than you can move, technically sound, and then just make incremental loading increases. Because you don't have to worry about that situation of that 500-pound squatter who's going from 135 to 140 to 145. You've never squatted before, right? So if getting off the couch is a squat for you currently, then putting 20-kilo bar on your back is going to be progressive overload. We actually have data on untrained sedentary people who are gaining a little bit of muscle mass on a walking program
Mm.
because they're sedentary, right? So they're moving their body weight.
Yeah.
Exactly, 100%. So it's almost a non-issue that a novice can't accurately record a 1RM, and you think, oh shoot, then they can't do a percentage 1RM based program. You can. It's just if it's a conservative, like best you can do on the day without really pushing yourself to true failure, that's all good because it is still going to be sufficient overload for you.
Right.
And on the other side of it, if you're using kind of a subjective proximity to failure, like I'm going to choose a weight that I think I can do somewhere between 6 to 20 reps with. I don't have a ton of experience, but I'm pretty sure it's somewhere in that range. And I'm going to stop when I think I'm maybe 1 rep from failure. A novice won't be great at doing that. They might stop 3, 4 reps short when they're actually only when they think they're 1 rep short. But so what? Because they're not necessarily needing to go all the way to failure to make progress because they don't lift. They haven't done that. So there's a very, very low bar for making gains and even maxing out those gains. So like a novice doesn't need to go to failure. A novice doesn't need to lift at a high percent of 1RM. It just needs to be harder than what they're used to. And then as they gain proficiency and they gain confidence, they can start pushing closer and closer to failure. And eventually they'll get to a point where they overshoot instead of undershooting. They'll be like, I think I got 2 more, and then they get 1 more rep. And at that point, now they can actually, that's when you know they've built enough efficacy to start having a reasonably accurate gauge of how close am I to failure, and they can gauge their intensity. Or once they get a really, really stable bar path on bench and squats and deadlift, now they can start pushing that up and actually testing their 1RM and start using those as metrics to both program and also diagnose whether or not they're plateaued or making progress.
Right. Plus, as you mentioned, as a beginner, you're going from 60 to 120 pound squat within a period of a few weeks. So even if you did have to start too low, soon enough, it's going to be pretty heavy.
Exactly. And we have studies on that where, you do a 1RM test on someone who's recreationally trained,
Yep.
and they're okay enough to get through a 1RM test, but then, they get prescribed a percentage of that pre-test 1RM for 12 weeks, right? So by the end of it, and when they do their post-test 1RM, they've increased their strength, 15, 20%, right? So they went from a 100-pound squat to a 140-pound squat. And if they, at the end of that block, they were training at, say, 80, 85% of 1RM, that means they're using 80 to 85 pounds. And 80 to 85 pounds is not 80 to 85% of 140 pounds, right? It's a very low percentage. So it demonstrates that they're far outpaced, the intended relative intensity or relative load of 80% of 1RM. It's not. Now they're training with 50 to 60% of their 1RM, yet they're still making gains. So it just shows you that, yeah, I think when you use a percentage 1RM like that in a novice, you think you're training heavier than you are because they're outpacing the rate of adaptation that you're expecting, which is why there's sometimes value in using things like auto-regulation. But in a novice, it just doesn't matter because they can make great gains lifting 50 to 60% of 1RM because they've never had a 1RM before. They don't have, they're lifting 0%, So
Yeah.